Good afternoon, evening, or morning, wherever you are. And thank you for coming back and being part of our second session of the April board meeting for the IAASB. Today's session focuses on the issue of fraud and the response that we received to our discussion paper. And not only just to our discussion paper, the significant outreach and research undertaken by staff and the working group. Remember, we are at the information gathering and research activities phase of the project. We are just trying to determine now whether it is in the public interest to proceed with standard setting to enhance our requirements related to fraud. In today's session, the working group is asking the board to comment on possible actions detailed in agenda item 3. I really want to emphasize this. We are really not in the technical problem solving mode yet. I know we tend to want to go there, but it's really about giving the working group some observations about the feedback they've heard and about direction going forward. I wanted to share some of my observations because I thought the paper was excellent. And that's the first of all. I wanted to thank the working group and staff for putting together such a comprehensive paper. To me, what's really impressive is the outreach to the broad range of stakeholders who have participated in the process to date and the amount of background research that has been conducted. Secondly, I wanted to share some of my big takeaways for the paper itself. It's a big paper, but it has so much there. It does list a lot of actions, or considerations for the board to take on, but a few items really sort of stand out to me. First, the natural question I ask myself is, based upon what I've read and observed, would standard setting be justified, and should the working group therefore proceed with the project proposal? And I think, having read all the evidence in this paper, I think the answer must be yes. That it would be in the public interest to undertake some enhancements to our fraud standard. But enhancements, in my mind, don't necessarily mean a fundamental overhaul of the standard or a reshaping of the role of the auditor in relation to fraud. Instead, and I think that is something we've heard consistently from our stakeholders. Oh, 1 second. So sorry for this. This is the realities of working from home, that you get some phone calls ringing and I can't turn it off. So instead, we are hearing a few themes that rather than a fundamental rewrite of the standard itself, we're hearing a few things about where we could either revise or provide guidance. And I'll share a few that came out to the top of my list, but they're by no means comprehensive. What I see is a lot of suggestions about linkages to other standards needing to be considered, particularly in the application of a risk-based approach. While there's little support for adding the concept of suspicious mindset, there seems a lot of support for highlighting the role of professional skepticism, as we've done in a lot of other standards to date. We need to consider how the auditor communicates with those charged with governance and external stakeholders on matters related to fraud. This includes consideration of the auditor's report, clearly room to modernize the standard or provide guidance as it relates to technology, and that we need to consider a mixture of standard setting and guidance. My caution to us as we could push the guidance front is that we need to focus on where our scarce input resources will have the most public interest impact. If we're working on one, maybe it diverts attention from the other. These are just but a few themes that I picked up, and the ones that resonated with me most. I really look forward to the discussion today. And Lynn, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Tom, and welcome to the session, everybody. I wanted to just reinforce what Tom said up front. This is our comprehensive feedback on what we heard, not only in from the discussion paper but also from outreach and from research. And so some of the length of the paper and the complexity is represented by us trying to give you a comprehensive picture of all of the work that has been done to date. Before I move on, I'd like to particularly thank the staff involved in this project. We have Angela, who has joined us for a year until September. We have Bev and we have Hankin. And I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the hardworking working group, Julie, Diane and Len. So I intend, as we go through this presentation, to pause at points in time for discussion and get your views, because, next slide please, Michelle. The objective of the session is, number one, to give you the overview of everything we've heard, and secondly, to get your views on a possible way forward. And it's important that we get your input at this stage so that we can actually, like we do in terms of our framework of activities, we can actually put it through the funnel and move down to what really has to be done, because there's certainly a lot of desire for something to be done. Next slide, please. Okay, we received 85 letters about the discussion document, and they came from across the world and were comprehensive in nature. We believe we've got both a good geographical view and also, moving right on, a good, next slide please, view across different stakeholders. And we were particularly pleased to hear from some groups that we don't usually hear from, like IATA, the airline organisation, put in a response, which is unusual. So it was nice to see that broad range of input coming through. And obviously we had also good input from regulators, the monitoring group, etc. Moving to the next slide, please. Okay, you're going to see this slide throughout the morning, or your afternoon, or your evening, whichever one it is, but it's morning in New Zealand. This is the question we're going to ask you ongoingly as we go through the, each of the sections. The second question is about omissions, and you might like to think about whether you want to upfront talk about that, do it during each session, or right at the end. We've given you all of those options and very happy to hear about anything further you want to discuss at any point in time. But it will seem repetitive to have it ongoingly there. Next slide, please. The first section we're going to go through is potential topics for standard setting, and we'll break that into 3 different discussion areas, so that because this is the meaty part of the paper. And the first thing I'm going to go through is the desire for the stronger linkages to 315 on risk assessment, topics regarding enhanced transparency of those charged with governance, and enhanced linkage to 550 related parties. And once I've done those 3 sections, We will pause for feedback. Next slide, please. Okay. At the conclusion of 315, the normal, conforming and consequential amendments were made to 240, and they were obviously useful in aligning the two standards. But we heard in the feedback a call for more robust information between 240 and 315. People asked us to better integrate the auditor's considerations relating to fraud in the risk identification and assessment process so that it was not isolated or separated from the work done on error. In fact, we heard that there seems to be a focus on the work done on error, with fraud more of an afterthought or an add-on at the end. And so respondents encouraged us to think about how we could better integrate the work on fraud. The working group is of the view that such changes could be made through standard setting by modifying or enhancing the requirements and application material as necessary to provide that better linkage between 240 and 315. And more detail on that is provided in the paper. Next slide, please. The next two areas that people asked us to look for, there was a very strong call for strengthening the goal of those charged with governance. That was particularly in terms of two-way communication, which resonates with the work we did in the Quality Suite. But there was also a request for more touch points, not just at the end of the audit. I note that this particular message was also a strong theme at the roundtables last year. And there was also a call for strengthening the link between 240 and 550. As Tom has said, those linkages across all of the standards is one of the themes that will run right through this presentation. There is certainly a strong call and a strong theme for people to see clearly the linkages across the standards to our fraud standard. Next slide, please. So that very quickly brings us to the first of the questions, and at this stage I think it would be appropriate, if anyone has any overall comments they'd like to make, is to make those overall comments as well as answering the questions that are on the board in terms of 315, the communication with those charged with governance and related parties. So back to you, Tom.
Great. Okay. We're open to comment now, and I look forward to any hands. First, Ada.
Yes, thank you, Tom, and thank you, Lynn, and the working group for putting all of this together. It was a lengthy piece, but not too hard to digest. It seems, and this is just the flavor that I got for reading, or after reading all the comment letters, I think I got a message out of it that that narrowing the expectation gap would not be solved by standard setting alone. It seemed to be quite prominently there, and probably more so in the area of going concern, but also here, that this is a broader ecosystem issue that we also need to, where we need to involve others as well to narrow the expectation gap. And so I'm wondering, because we're now diving into what we can do, and of course we have to play our part, but I'm also wondering how we can best spend our time, and if some of that time spent is helping other players to change the ecosystem, if that has a broader impact than focusing on our own standards, I would be happy to divert the time on that interaction with the other parties. And you do cover it, but all the way at the end. And it gives me this impression that it's, it's not an afterthought, but I think it's much more important in the construct of where we need to move the whole ecosystem forward. So I would ask you to maybe have a think about that. Let's see, I am in respect of these 3 items that you have on here when it comes to possible actions. Yes, I agree, of course, that the linkage to ISO 315 could potentially be stronger. Well, I am aware that 315 hasn't been in operation yet, and there's so it's presumed that it's not strong enough. Also wondering how the CUSP drafting principles work in there, because this seems to suggest that we are cross-referring a lot more. And when I look at these measures, I think it is important that we all keep in the back of our mind what the difference is we're actually going to make, and whether that's proportionate in respect of the overall responses. And I don't mind, for example, related parties, closer or enhanced linkage, but I also, I think if I counted correctly, there were only 4 respondents that brought 550 up. In respect of 315, where we're talking about understanding of the entity and the internal controls, I think that is potentially an area where we can be bolder. This is an area where also the COSO has issued its fraud management guide, and is pointing to very specific controls that they would expect to have in place. So if we want to make a change, can we be stronger towards the entities that are subject to audit as to what extent they are having the controls in place? And if not, what do we then do? And I think at least a robust discussion with those charged with governance would come into play. And maybe through that, a encouragement for them to disclose in their financial reporting how they are on top of managing the risk of fraud, bribery, and corruption. That also, and this may be a bit of a tonal matter, Lynn, but when I read the paragraphs around enhanced transparency with those charged with governance, it was very much what the auditor needed to do. And it was, it does say two-way communication, but a lot of it was us talking to those charged with governance, where I would, for the purpose of this important issue, which fraud clearly is, and this is and how I do it in practice as well, I would challenge those charged with governance how they are sure that management has their act together and that fraud is prevented to the extent possible, and which of course, creates much more of a two-way discussion. So those are some of the comments that come to mind. I have some more, but I think I've taken the microphone long enough. Thank you very much, Lynn and Tom.
Thank you. Josephine?
Thanks, Tom. I'm going to echo your comment right at the beginning that I also thought this was an excellent paper. Thanks to Lynn and the task force, Bev, Angela as well, and Hankin for all your hard work here, clearly coming through. Lots of really, really good evidence here supporting the proposals that the task force have put forward, and some extremely helpful advice from our stakeholders in a lot of areas, including in the academic areas, which is always well received. In that vein, Lynn, I have support for mostly all of your proposals in this paper as an overall comment. I've got a couple of suggestions as we go through each of these topics and sections, but generally really pleased with what the task force are proposing. On stronger linkages to 315, I just wanted to say, following Ado, I agree with his point about a more robust understanding. I think that's certainly something to look to. I was interested in the findings of the academic report, which is the role of power in financial statement fraud schemes, that discusses the fraud triangle and its limitations. I thought that was quite an interesting piece of research, and maybe there's something we can do there, perhaps not necessarily in the application material, but maybe in non-authoritative guidance, but just something to think about, notwithstanding obviously Tom's caution about resources and making sure what we do is in the public interest and meeting those objectives. There are a couple of things I noted in the first section dealing with risk assessment that struck me as being important, but they didn't necessarily come through. One was in 20C, which was emphasising the importance for the auditor follow up when responses to inquiries of management and those charged with governance are implausible. I thought that was quite an interesting point to think about. And then emphasising that the auditor in 24A should focus on fraud risk factors that are specific to the entity and its circumstances, as rather than just take the checklist that the teams are, say, used to using and trying to bring those into the particular audit that they're carrying out. I mean, we often find that auditors too readily accept as well explanations for some of these activities that are going on, because they're trying to link their fraud risk factors with what's going on in the actual entity. So something around that would be quite useful. In terms of enhanced transparency with those charged with governance, that's supported, of course, from my end. In the UK consultation on 240, this was an area where we did propose enhancements, and also to bring greater emphasis to the importance of discussions with those charged with governance about fraud, as well as risk of material misstatement due to error. So there's a better balance in that regard. And on that, on Ado's point as well, I support what Ado is saying about making sure that we are challenging those charged with governance. I thought the important, the point about, I'm going to scroll down here. The point about effective participation and their independence was a very good point. I think certainly somewhere where we should explore further. The only one I wasn't quite sure about was about proposing in writing with those charged with governance with the auditor's responsibility specific to fraud. I couldn't see the evidence supporting that proposal, but it might be elsewhere in the paper, and it was just put here because that was a better home for it. So just questioning that one. And again, not wanting to take the microphone too long, I thought again those proposals in respect of ISA 550 were very good. ISA 550 has some really good material on fraud, so actually linking back to it is really important. It's not odd that it's there and not in 240, but maybe drawing those links would actually help a great deal. So that's it from me. Thanks again.
Thank you. Fernando.
Thank you, Tom. Hello, everyone. Lynn, thanks for the presentation. Very impressive to read all the information from the papers. No doubts that comments came from all around the world with different point of views. different needs or different concerns. I guess the topic of fraud is something that we live every day in practice. It's a topic that it's evolving as well, depending of the circumstances, the nature of the business, even the culture, and we need to adapt pretty quickly to the environment that we're living. The paper has a lot of good suggestions. I agree with the general direction on the items that or themes that as a whole that you're proposing for changes in the standard, the ones related to guidance, others that, yep, that maybe there's nothing that we could do, and others that require more analysis. But one of the things I love about your presentation is that you're pretty quick and you go straight to the questions. You make the topic pretty easy, and taking that into account, I think what this is exactly what we need to do, because otherwise having a lot of information, having huge papers with different point of views, it could take us forever. I think the message that we're getting here is there are a few items that yes we need to focus on, and the comments that probably we're gonna hear during this session and maybe others are gonna be very general. Once we really go into the details of drafting the changes in the standard and the guidance, that's probably when we're gonna be spending more time, and that's exactly the moment when we're gonna be struggling a lot. So if we can really pinpoint where we want to go, I think that's gonna be pretty clear for everyone on the board and everyone hearing about this topic. I very much support the proposed actions for A, B, and D, and I share the comments from Edo and Josephine as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Sachika.
Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon and good evening. I also echo that this paper is excellent to read. I'd like to express my general overviews from reading the issue paper, as well as comment letters, and also from my outreaches, as a sort of general stances that I have in considering what enhancement of the standard will be necessary with regard to fraud. I think there are 2 points which I believe need to be considered. First of all, I think it needs to clearly differentiate the cases when there is no indication of fraud versus when the auditor has identified indication or suspicious of fraud. Because I think addressing fraud needs considerable time and resources. It is therefore important to clarify the differences in order to lead the engagement teams and the firms to shift their work with more attention and resources when there is an indication or suspicious of fraud. And secondly, I think it needs to clarify what it actually means to the auditors to strengthen auditors' consideration of fraud. In other words, it has to be clear what and how the auditors should do differently to comply with those new requirements. For example, in my outreach meeting, there was a comment raised on possible action number 1. Point C, that it is not clear what the difference is between the information obtained through acceptance and the continuance process and the information obtained through the auditor's risk assessment process. This is just one example, but I think it should be taken into consideration how the changes in the requirement will impact the auditor's work when making a change. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Eric?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks to Lynn and the working group and the staff. An amazing paper, very thorough and comprehensive. My general comments would go something like this. I felt I was walking into a very expensive restaurant, and the waiter gave me a menu with 55 items on it. And each and every one of them sounded really tasty. But I realized I've only got $75 in my pocket. So what am I going to do first? Do I start with dessert, which is my favorite, or do I go somewhere else? And so as I went through the issues paper and I looked at a lot of the proposals, I was trying to ask myself, or I was saying to myself, I don't think we can do all of this in a reasonable time. I'm worried that some of these actions may take time, but may not make a meaningful difference to whatever the public interest issues are that we're dealing with. And so I was a bit concerned about whether we needed to, a bit along the lines of Fernando, kind of pinpoint really what are the key public interest changes that we need to make to this standard, rather than just kind of opening it up and working through these topics from 1 to 21 or whatever it is. And I really related to, Edo's comments resonated with me as well in terms of, I think there are some things here which are outside of standard setting, which potentially the board could be involved with that would be more meaningful in terms of an impact. And so at this point, I just don't have a good feel for, how this all fits together in the best way to meet the public interest issues and the board's roles and responsibilities. Having said that, on the first three topics, topic A to do with the 315 linkages, that is something that practitioners have mentioned to me in terms of certainly with the extant 315 and how 240 integrates with 315. I'm not sure if that's been fully addressed in revised 315, and so we probably would benefit from exploring that. With respect to transparency with those charged with governance, I kind of had the same comments as Edo in the sense of, I think what's needed here is for those charged with governance to take ownership of their responsibilities, and while the auditor can increase the communications with those charged with governance, if they're not listening, I don't think they're going to improve the quality of the audit or address some of the public interest issues. So, communication is a good thing, but I'm just not sure how much value that's going to have without other efforts that go along with it. And with the related parties, as Josephine mentioned, there is some good stuff in 550 already around fraud and related parties, and I wasn't sure how much more was going to be needed to link 240 with 550. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Kai Uwe?
Tom, thanks. Good evening. And Lynn, thank you very much for the paper and my acknowledgement to the working group and the staff too. I'm very impressed that you have taken into account more than 200 academic papers, because I know this, I have been involved in creating the list with the academic papers. So let me thank you very much for this. The paper is very good to read. My reaction on a general comment, especially on the standard setting, is very close to Eric, to Edo, to Fernando, and also a little bit to Josephine, because I'm very concerned with the approach being taken to develop the proposed action on standard setting, which I'm not convinced may lead to solutions that are in the public interest. The list of proposed action to change standards reads like a wish list. Eric, you created the picture of the restaurant. I have the wish list based on a poll of stakeholder suggestions and uses a kind of shotgun approach of potential enhancements without any consideration of those costs of each of the measures being proposed versus their potential benefits of better auditor performance in relation to fraud. This will only lead to longer standards that are more difficult to apply and may not even significantly improve auditor detection of fraud. It seems to me that this kind of shotgun approach results from the lack of a real root cause analysis as to what caused major frauds over the last 10 years and whether potential audit failure in relation to those frauds resulted from deficient auditing standards or deficient auditor performance. If the main problem is deficient auditor performance, the problem is likely to be primarily a quality management issue that more detailed requirements and guidance in auditing standards can at most just marginally improve. If the problem is deficient auditing standard, then there needs to be some analysis as to which particular deficiencies cause the problem so that the IAASB can zero in on those changes needed that would lead to significant improvement in auditor performance as reasonable cost. Overall, I believe we are proposing a list of standard setting solutions without knowing whether the solutions actually address the problem. This is my general comment. I have brief comments to the three actions which are mentioned here. One second. My comment for the first action. In my view, it is difficult for me to determine whether I should agree with the proposed possible action 1, because it is unclear to me which kinds of audit failures due to deficient standards we are trying to address, as I've mentioned before. The suggestions sound reasonable individually, but it is unclear to me whether individually or collectively they will actually significantly improve the auditor's ability to deal with fraud. I have a second comment relating to action 1. Item little e in potential in this action number 1 would lengthen the application material without a substantive change because the appendices have the same status and application material. It is therefore unclear to me what the benefit of little e is. Then to little f, in relation to item f in potential action number 1, it seems to me that double I is substitute under little I. That's a formal comment. Then my brief comment to the possible action number 2, as a matter of principle, I agree with improving auditor communication with those charged with governments about fraud. However, without knowing whether a lack of appropriate communication with those charged with governance led to auditors not dealing with fraud appropriately in the past, it is difficult for me to evaluate the appropriateness of the individual items proposed. And my last comment relates to possible action number 3. In relation to this possible action, I believe that enhancing the requirements in ISA 240 in relation to related parties as proposed in little a will only duplicate the fraud consideration for related parties already included in ISA 550. However, providing better links to ISA 550 may be an appropriate approach. I support items little b and little c. Tom, thanks very much that, as all the others, I have had the microphone so long. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm gonna just pause here because I'm really confused with how some people are interpreting the board paper a little bit, because my understanding of what the task the working group put forward is what they've heard in their consultations, whether by their discussion paper responses, the roundtables, and their academic research. I'm not sure that the task force, a working group, was suggesting that when they say standard setting for this or application guidance for that, that they were specifically saying thou shalt go down that path yet. I thought it was more of a categorization of potential actions as a result of what they've heard. Lynn, is that correct? I can't hear. You're on mute, Lynn.
That's absolutely, Tom. I mean, the reason we've used proposed possible actions, which are too many words really, but it is to try and emphasise that we are obviously still thinking about what those actions might be. I'm actually finding, Tom, the discussion really useful, because what we are trying to do is get all of the items that we've heard, and we have heard such a lot, and there's obviously a problem. We're trying to get them through the funnel to what is actually useful and what we should do. So the board's comments around prioritisation, working out what's going to be in the public interest, making sure changes are real, are very, very much in our heads. And this discussion is helping refine some of that, because what I have heard from people is that, 315, maybe standard setting, those charged with governance, quite a lot of interest in doing something, but maybe not standard setting, and 550, some real questions across it. Now, that's just what we need at this point in time to give us that sense of what's important. So I'm very comfortable with where we're at this point in time, and many of the comments resonate with our discussions in more depth. So I think we're heading in the right direction. None of us have all the answers at present, and that's but these discussions are going to help us get to September, but when we put the project proposal in front of you. Can I make a couple of other comments while I've just to sum up on what I've heard?
Yeah, we have, just so you know, we have 6 other hands up still, yeah. But I'm happy to have you jump in. I guess my big point, Lynn, to you is that the task force working group here wasn't proposing solutions yet. And I just wanted to make sure that the board understood that you were just feeding back what you have heard of the public in a very comprehensive fashion, that these were not, you were not insinuating that you were moving that this would be the priority of standard setting or not at this point.
We are proposing actions. I mean, so we are floating some ideas out for people. The majority of what we're doing is providing feedback, but we certainly have some proposed actions, and we certainly are looking for feedback on those. So it's a little bit of both, but mainly feedback.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. I thought of the clarity. So do you want to break in here and give a few things, or you want to hear from 6 others now?
Let me just make a couple of comments before we move on. I am going to get to the ecosystem, but I hear the importance of all the players. We've had some scrutiny in-depth discussions on that, and we can only do what we can do. And so it's how we can focus our attention to actually make the whole ecosystem better, but staying within our remit and our mandate. And that's particularly so in the education area, where it would be very nice to say this isn't working, we can help, but it's not really our job. So just making that comment. I like the link to internal controls and tone at the top and culture are key golden themes running through the feedback letters and certainly need to be considered. And the final comment I'd just like to make is we are suggesting a variety, not just standard setting. And the reason we're doing that is we think that there is some really rich material in the 85 feedback letters and in the research and in the round tables that can just be picked up and used as guidance. So some of this would not be making new material up. It would be purely taking material that has actually been fed to us. There's been some really, really good stuff come back in the letters. So we think there's an opportunity to use that further. So I think they were the things I wanted to pick up, and I appreciate the rich comments we're getting. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. Isabel, sorry for the pause.
Good evening, everybody. It's a very interesting paper, and there's a lot of material to work on in it. I will comment on these three topics. And on these three topics, I thought that everything that is being asked for, to my mind, is already there in the current standard. The linkages are there, the transparency is there. However, people do not perceive it. And maybe the feedback we get is that people apply the IAASB one by one without having the full picture. And so we need to do something to remind why the things are done and to remind how the IAASBs are interact among themselves. If I take, for example, IAASB 550, and I remember very well the time it was developed at the time of Clarity. The chair was Gérard Trémolière and assisted by Cedric, so they are kind of my grandfather and father in the IAASB family. And at that time, the only reason why IAASB 550 was developed and expanded, it was because there was a fraud risk in related party. If there was no fraud risk in related party, there would be no IAASB on related party. We don't have IAASBs on all the disclosures and on all the accounts of the financial statements. We have an IAASB on related party because there is a fraud risk on related party. So if people don't realize that, yes, something needs to be done, but it's not something new. We are not discovering it. It was done on purpose. And therefore, I think what would be interesting for me in the future steps of the project is to know if we are going to do full rewrite or limited amendments, issue by issue we are raising. Are we going to add some requirements? I mean, are we going to add some shall, the auditor shall do something? Are we going to rewrite totally some sections of the standards? Or are we going just to clarify the wording? For me, it's very important because having in mind the CUS project, I really want to be able to answer to the questions when we will be done, what has really changed. And if we have clarified something, we may just have clarified something for the people to get to understand clearly what they need to do. but maybe we will not change much, and which is a good sign because the standard is not broken. But we really we need to be careful and to be very clear if we are clarifying something or if we are creating something new. And last comment on little b, who's charged with governance. When I read the feedback we had, and I agree with the feedback we had, I thought that often the people who answered had in mind the governance of listed companies or PI. Some of the suggested enhancements would be very difficult to implement in less complex entities, especially in situation where the management and who's charged with governance are the same people. So we will have to have that in the back of our mind when we will draft that section. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Wendy?
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Lynn, and your working group for an extremely thorough, comprehensive, well-done paper that initially I was a little bit overwhelmed by, but I did have to take myself back to what the purpose was, which was really synthesizing everything that was heard in a lot of different places, and that gave me even more appreciation for what you did. I keep having this vision of a funnel, because the funnel is very important. And, we go to details and we go back to the big picture, and how do we get to a place where we're really making an improvement that will make a difference, that will narrow the expectation gap, and at the same time, not only rely on standard clarifications or non-authoritative guidance or anything like that, but what's going to change in the ecosystem and how can we be part of engendering that change. So some things I thought about before I dove into the 29 different actions to consider. Broadly, very supportive of the accumulation of the different items. Something broadly that came to mind when I got to, maybe it was related parties. Anyway, to have a look at what other standard setters have already done with some of these standards. You mentioned the PCAOB, but I know there are others, and whether or not what those standard setters have done have impacted quality in terms of the audits. I will have to say I particularly like what Kaiui said, as well as Ito, which resonated to me, is in terms of when we look at standards, when we look at standard setting, we need to stand back and really continue to think about when is enough enough. Piling on sometimes doesn't really get us to a better place. And with that, I'll just give some detailed observation. Then I went back to some details. So for example, in 315, item 1A, making risk assessment procedures more robust. I don't think anybody would disagree with that, but I always try on the action, and I was having trouble figuring out what corroborative evidence might be. And so things like that is what I looked at. I wasn't really sure there would be value for the amount of time to write that standard, write the application material, and then execute it in the field. I have a small comment on F, which I'll just send to you. Act for 2. For item 2A, little number 2, and I'm not sure if somebody said this before, so apologies for repeating. I wasn't really sure how little 2 was in the purview of the auditor, requiring in ISO 240 that the auditor assess whether the remediation measures taken by management those charged with governance are appropriate. I wasn't really sure how we would measure that. So my detailed observation there. And then my other detailed observation in 2 is 4 in the same section. It seems very broad, and I thought that the biases that the auditors have identified that management has, I thought come through other standards. So, whether it's in the CAMs or, other presentations and discussions that we have with those charged with governance. So wasn't really sure that was necessary. Maybe that ties into what Isabel said. Some of these items may already be there. It might be they're not performed consistently. So maybe that's something else we need to focus on. And then number 3, I think I tied that into a general comment, and that was, I like the idea of looking at what other standard setters had already made changes to. And that's it. Thank you again, Lynn.
Thanks, Wendy.
Thank you, Wendy. Chenwei?
Thank you very much, Tom, and a very good morning from Singapore. Thanks, Lynn. I want to just start off by expressing my admiration to you, the working group, and all the staff for the tremendous amount of work, clearly pulling so much information together. And it's a long piece of paper, but I must say it is actually very enjoyable to read, which is no mean feat. So thank you so much. And a lot of what we see here, again, also echo what my organization has been doing in terms of the phase 2 of our the expectation gap work that Anthony, my TA, is leading together with DNZ and CPA Canada. So we see a lot of overlap there, echoing the findings that you put in the paper. My overall theme is very similar to what others have said. I like the restaurant analogy by Eric, 75 Canadian dollars. That's very similar to Singapore dollars. So we have the same resource here as well. So I think the question is really being very mindful about the impact of the many different things that we're proposing and being selective of what will give us the biggest impact, because public interest impact here. And I think as we investigate that, bring that into the way we issue our guidance, the way we draft our requirements and application material, in terms of helping the auditors understand why these are there. I know this is what has been mentioned in the paper as well, but I think that is critically important. A very simple example, we also heard through our outreach a regulator saying, auditors are doing this journal entry testing without really knowing what they're trying to do and therefore not doing it right. So in order to have the impact, you have to do it right. And in order to do it right, you need to understand why. So I know, again, this is something that has been emphasized in the paper. So I think we can't emphasize that enough. So that is the, I guess, overall comment. In terms of the recommendation throughout, again, everything is very well thought through. So I find it really easy to say I agree to everything. And I have some minor comments here and there, and I'll send that through as well. But just in terms of the first 3 items, I thought I might just highlight one thing, which is on those charged with governance. And I think it's probably quite similar to the point that Isabel has mentioned as well. I think those charged with governance obviously operate differently for different kind of entities, and 260 application material A1 to A8 provide very good guidance on different forms. I think I agree that there's a need to consider how the requirements around the communication be made meaningful in the context of the different structure. So for example, owner-managed entity, what kind of comment is needed? What is the objective of such communication? The objective and outcome will be quite different from the com with the audit committee of a listed company. And also quite often for a LCE or a small entity where the process and control are potentially deficient, I think, and this is probably a point that's broader for LCE, practitioners may actually benefit more from guidance on the so what. right? So if it's deficient, so what? So I think that is something we may want to also bear in mind for the smaller category of audit entities, in terms of helping the auditors not tick the box, but do it in a way that will actually add value to the audit in terms of fraud identification and support. So I'll leave it at that. But again, thank you so much for all the great work here. Thanks, Lee.
Thank you.
Thank you. Three more, Kai, then Sue, then Roger.
Thank you, Tom. I'll just start by echoing some of the comments that have already been said. I'm really impressed by the work that's been done, summarizing all the information that we've gotten from the outreach and the responses that we got. I think, as some people said, it's a lengthy paper, but it's an easy read, and it's summarizing the feedback that we've gotten so far in a really good and structured way. So similar to what Chung Weed just said, I think it's easy to go through the paper and agree that yes, this is an area that we received feedback we need to do standard setting, and or that it's suggested that we do standard setting and we should explore doing that. I think this paper does not say that we're going to do, and we're not proposing what kind of changes in detail we're doing. And I think that is for the further steps. And it's almost listening to some of the board members' comments. They're eager to go through the next phase and almost trying to say, how can this solve, and how can we judge what the result of the changes will be? I think, as Tom earlier summarized, the purpose here is mainly to summarize what we heard and group them and say what are the areas that we'll look further into. And I think this the paper does this in a perfect way. And to me, I agree very much with the direction that you're heading. As we all heard, the difficulty starts when we will start drafting what will go there. And that's when it becomes more interesting to see whether or not we will fix the issues or not. But the general comment is really like what we've done so far, and strong support for the direction, and agree with both A, B, and C on what you've proposed so far. Thank you.
Great. Sue?
Thank you. And Lynn and the team, thank you for a great job here. A lot of what Ado and Eric said resonated with me, so I won't repeat it, but just to note that I agree, particularly around Ado's comments on communications. I think I'm broadly supportive of the proposals you have here to explore standard setting. And there's a lot of comments about linkage with other standards, and I think one of the challenges we will have is working out the prioritization of some of those things. And I would encourage, as you're thinking through that process, to consider where the linkages can best impact either how auditors apply the existing standards better, or what it is that we want auditors to do differently. I think some of the suggestions could just lead to repeating material that's already there, which I don't think is particularly helpful. And I think the other thing is reflecting the way in which the standards are integrated, and there was a reference to breaking down some of the silos, which I think is really important. So those kind of things I think could have a great impact. I was particularly taken by some of the external material that you had, and particularly in 22B, where there was some data around the extent of collusive fraud, and actually references to the difference in the types of fraud that are perpetrated between different types of entities. And I think those kind of things building into particularly something like 315 could be quite meaningful in helping improve the practical application of some of the standards. In the context of the specific questions, I think the only thing I wanted to add was in the transparency piece, particularly outside of the public interest companies to just be conscious of the impact of adding text and reporting requirements that could end up being boilerplate and adding less value. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Roger.
Thanks, Tom, and again, congratulations, Lynn and the team. Comprehensive paper, very evidence-based, which is what we need. So, in order to make those determinations, going last, again, there's nothing new that I will be saying. Echo a lot of the comments that Edo picked up, and a lot of people have picked up. Emphasis on ecosystem and how we can best deal in ecosystem as to where we make a change. I did get the impression that we're in the continuous improvement stage of the standard as distinct from a complete overhaul. And how that reflects in our standard setting process will be a consideration going forward. In a continuous improvement, it is hard to argue against a lot of the proposals for consideration at this stage. Certainly stronger links with 315, given 315's been recently updated. Without repeating 315, I would support the enhanced transparency with those charged with governance. Really comes back to the ecosystem and how we deal with in those particular areas, emphasising as part of the root cause the importance of those charged with governance, recognising their responsibility and how we can deal with it within our remit will be there. With Isabel on 550, I did see related parties as very closely related to fraud. So if we are missing something there under continuous improvement, and we may be able to pick something up through your courses of action as to the continuous improvement. But I did not necessarily see that link was already broken at this particular stage. But like others, under a continuous improvement regime, I'm supportive of most of the proposals going through for consideration. But certainly the messaging that we want is that if we're going to make a real impact here, this has to be a whole part of ecosystem type of approach. And I don't think we can continuously lose the message, even though we need to concentrate on what's under our remit. Thanks.
Thanks, Roger. Jim.
Thank you, Tom. Just three comments. One is you had an awful lot of information in this paper, Lynn. I appreciate it. There's actually some pretty interesting comments from some of the respondents. And to move on, I think one thing, and we have discussed this with the CAG, one question that came up is the fundamental question. In the last 10 years or so, we've had some pretty spectacular frauds worldwide. And is there a nexus between what we're doing as a profession and what 240 requires or will require that would mitigate the issue or identify the issues, at least in those frauds? And that part seems to be a little bit missing. I see you do have some research papers in here, but that would make me feel much better about choosing what to do is if I knew what was done wrong or not done in the first place for these spectacular frauds. And the other point that has come from the CAG is, and you reference it in here, relates to adding to the report. And we're very concerned about the length of documentation, but in this case, length of reporting. I think there might be some feedback from the CAG that they would not want additional wording in the report. So that's pretty specific. I know that you're just in the beginning of this, so I'll just share those 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. I'm just seeing if anyone else would like to comment on this. So again, I think there's some consistent themes coming out. First of all, I think everyone's has sort of continuous improvement mindset to the standard, not a radical overhaul mindset to the standard. Everyone was appreciative of having the depth of feedback. Some comments about ecosystem, actually a lot of comments about ecosystem and being conscious of people's roles. I think Roger gave a really interesting point though at the end, is like conscious of what we could actually do from a standard setter's perspective. And I think that's something that the working group will need to consider, is what practically we can do and how much authority we have as well. And then clearly a lot of, we can't do everything on the menu. It's sort of like those restaurants where you go to that have like 17 pages of things and you can't decide what to eat. But I think that was an apt analogy raised as well. So Lynn, back to you to digest and to see how you reacted to what we heard.
Thank you all very much for the comments. Just to assure you, we are doing what work we can to look at root causes, and the staff are pursuing that, and I'll get to that later in the presentation. What we do know from the feedback and the research we've received to date is tone at the top and internal controls make a big difference. So we aren't going to lose sight of some of those big areas that we need to perpetually have in mind if we're going to make any useful changes. In terms of the 3 specific questions asked, I heard some cautious acceptance of doing some work on the linkage between 315 and 240 and maybe some standard setting. I was particularly struck by the importance of 315 hasn't been implemented yet. And so making sure that we don't fix what isn't broken in that area, I think, is going to be important, and to be careful that some of the comments that have been made just because 315 is new and people are implementing it. In terms of those charged with governance, reading between the lines, there was not just standard setting, but what else should we be doing in that area? And I heard a definite question mark over 550, whether we really needed standard setting in this area. So useful comments, and we will certainly go through those as a working group. Shall I move on, Tom?
Please do. We'll go for another 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and then we'll take a break, okay?
Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. One of the big proposals in the discussion paper was whether we introduced the term suspicious mindset, and there was not a lot of support for introducing that term universally. It was considered that it would set up an adversarial situation between the auditor and the client, and that this was not in the public interest. And that was a reasonably strong theme that came through the response letters. Equally, though, there was a call for more on professional skepticism. So keep professional skepticism and build on the work that we've already done. And in particular, people talked about what we have added to 315 and 540, which was comforting. And also maybe we could have a stand back in this area. Where our thinking is here is obviously not to pursue suspicious mindset, but to think a little bit more about when do you move into that mode, and in what circumstances might you need to, would an audit benefit from moving to a suspicious mindset? And we're still thinking in that area, and we'll bring it back to the board for a future discussion. And generally, work on professional skepticism. There's no point just putting in a requirement, be skeptical. It is around examples and ways of doing it. So where we're thinking is potentially in the non-authoritative guidance area. But this is an area that we'll bring back to the board. Next slide, please. On journal entries, this is still a point of pain for many people, and it's clear we need to do something here. It's probably a mix of standard setting and non-authoritative guidance, and maybe we can fix it by a link to 315 in terms of risk assessment. There's also links in this area with the audit evidence working group. So that's the first issue. The second one is people are asking us to modernise 240 in terms of technology. This is a fairly common call across all of our standard setting at present, and it's obviously something we need to do collaboratively with the technology working group, and we look forward to working with them. Can we move on 2 slides, please? Because rather than pausing here, because much of what we're talking about here is work in progress, and so I'm going to move right through this section and only ask one question at the end of it, which will include those 2 slides I've just been through. In terms of non-material fraud, there were lots of views. It was a very common area considered by respondents to the letters, and our overall conclusion is that people do not support the need to expand the auditor's responsibility, but they need guidance. And this is an area where we're looking at what happens in terms of your people want to know what they do when they detect fraud. So that was the key point in that area. In terms of unpredictability procedures, people are calling for clarity of that, and we do have some very good research material that is one of those areas that we can use in terms of non-authoritative guidance around and unpredictability procedures, and that could actually be done quite quickly. Next slide, please. So this is an area where we're certainly looking at a mixture of application material and non-authoritative guidance. Next slide, please. Audit documentation. We heard in terms of fraud exactly what we're hearing in terms of every project, and certainly the discussion yesterday on CUSP was absolutely relevant. So whether we need to have special considerations in the documentary section of 340, just rely on the documentation standard, or do something more innovative in line with CUSP is an open question at this point in time. And finally, in this section, next slide, please. A call for some more robust requirements for planning and completion of analytics. And I've said this up front, and I think so has Tom, for enhanced linkages to other ISAs. And just to give you a sense of the extent of those, people have asked us to look at 220, 265, 330, 580, 600, 610. So it's a very extensive sense, and a lot of feedback that we want to see how all this fits together. And we have in mind that this may well be pictures rather than words. So I see a picture developing in this area. Whether we can make that work or not is unknown, but it's certainly something that we are considering as a possible way forward here. I know the areas I've just been through are, some of them are our work in progress, some of them are more shaped up, but interested in this point in pausing again and for any high-level thoughts people have in terms of all the slides from suspicious mindset through to enhanced linkages with other ISAs. So back to you, Tom.
Okay, it's a big chunk there.
It is.
So suspicious mindsets through linkages to other ISAs. Any comments specifically on these topics? Josephine.
Thanks, Lynn. Again, as I said in my overarching comments, I agree with the direction that you've been responsive to the respondents' comments. The evidence has been very fruitful and helpful. I also wanted to agree with your comment about developing material. I mean, there's so much material here that can be lifted and used fairly easily. So that was what I meant about some really great nuggets from our stakeholders in the responses. In the unpredictability procedures, some of the suggestions in the McKee, I think it was academic report, are useful in terms of scalability, for example, on that, in that respect. Audit documentation, analytical procedures, agree. Enhanced linkages to other ISAs. I think the linkages to 220 and ISQM1 about training, resources, tone at the top, firm culture, and ISA 240 would actually be very beneficial, and perhaps we can draw on some of the work of JICPA in this area, particularly around education and training concerning fraud and supervision and review when addressing risk of fraud. I know we touch on this paragraph later, I think it's paragraph 150 in respect of education, but we already have quite a few hooks in our quality management standards in this area. So if there's something we could do around there, or if you could explore what we could do about there using our existing standards, I think that would be a great help. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Josephine. Sachika.
Thank you. I'd like to comment some of the action, including in this chunk. First, with regard to possible action for specific suspicious mindset, I agree with the working group view to not to pursue the concept of a suspicious mindset broadly in the ISAs. Although I do not support the idea that ISAs use the wording suspicious mindset in addition to professional skepticism, because I think it's confusing. But I agree that we should explore whether limited circumstances may necessitate the use of an element of the concept of suspicious mindset. It is not clear yet about what the definition of suspicious mindset is, but I assume its requirement to be alert is more tense comparing to us professional skepticism. And if so, the element of suspicious mindset should not be required in all cases, as you mentioned, but rather it will be effective to be used under certain circumstances. For example, it will be effective to require the auditor to have the element of suspicious mindset when there is a suspicion or indication of fraud, or where fraud has been detected or identified. And with regard to action number 5, journal testing, I especially agree with the action on possible action number 5B to consider enhancing the application material or authoritative guidance to clarify what the auditor's objectives are when testing journal entries, and it helps the auditors to understand how to determine the nature, timing, and extent of the auditor's procedures. This should help with concerns I have heard that the testing is not as effective considering the amount of time and effort required, and analytical procedures using technologies are more effective in some cases. Also, I think it may be useful to gather examples and examine where fraud has actually been identified by journal testing. I think this examination is useful to reconsider what types of journal entry testing is worth the cost and effective. At last, this could be a matter of either 600, but I think it should also be clarified how to test journal entry testing in group audit. And lastly, with regard to possible action number 10, analytical procedures, I agree with possible action to consider the need to more robust analytical procedures, but I think it would be beneficial to consider necessary enhancement of analytical procedures in conjunction with necessary clarification on the extent of journal entry testing. As I commented on possible action number 5, I have heard that in some cases, it is more effective to allocate resources to the performance of analytical procedures using technologies than to the performance of journal entry testing. I therefore think we need to think about what types of enhancement is necessary in totality rather than just recurring more work effort in journal entry testing as well as analytical procedure respectively. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Eric.
Thanks, Tom. A lot of really meaty topics here. A lot of discussion around the table. Suspicious mindset, really supportive of moving away from using that term. As Sajiko says, there is no real definition, so I'm not really sure what we're driving at with that. So, I'm not really convinced that we should be exploring that any further, because I don't know how you switch from a professional skepticism mindset to a suspicious mindset and what that even looks like. I am also not convinced about using terminology like challenge and words like that, because again, those are not very well understood terms. And being part of the CUS project, we've just got told yesterday to cut back on the number of terms that we're using in the standards. So I'm a bit worried about that direction. But I do agree that with more emphasis on professional skepticism and potentially more application material or non-authoritative guidance on how auditors can appropriately respond to risk of material misstatement relating to fraud. My understanding from some of the academic research is that auditors are quite good at identifying where the risks might be, but they are not necessarily as good as they could be in responding to that. And I support the stand back approach that's being suggested. I'm also very supportive of the direction you're heading with the journal entry testing. I think it would be very helpful to bring into that the concept of risk-based and clarifying what the objectives are of the testing so that people understand, as Chun-Wee says, why they're doing it and therefore how they can do it. But we do need to consider the audits of less complex entities, and some audits are not done using advanced technologies, and so there needs to be a way of making that scalable somehow. The other one I would like to comment on is just on the non-material fraud. I agree with the direction there as well. I do believe that the standard is fine the way it is dealing with non-material fraud at the moment, but perhaps there could be some non-authoritative guidance to support some of the challenges that people are facing when they do identify non-material frauds. And with the last one I'll talk about is the documentation. And I know the fraud standard was issued a long time ago, and I realize that it doesn't require explicitly the documentation of fraud risk factors. And that is one of the proposed actions to explore, is whether those should be documented. And I think it might be worth going back to the standard to understand the rationale for that, because I think the concern at the time was that it could be inhibiting to auditors exploring how fraud could occur in an entity if they have to document every single idea that they come up with during their discussion at the engagement team or the engagement team discussion, and then having to explain how they've dealt with every single possibility. So I think we might need to just look back at the sort of basis for conclusions, if there was one at the time, on the rationale for that before we impose this additional obligation on the auditors. And lastly, I just would like to say I do support considering the linkages to other ISAs, although obviously there's a lot of ISAs that we could link to, and we need to do that sparingly. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Chun-Wei?
Thank you, Tom. Lena, well, first of all, I really like your decisiveness, the willingness to pivot and just change two blocks of discussion into one, although that takes a lot of scrolling through. My comment to this block is very brief. First of all, support the conclusion we reached on suspicious mindset. Well, it's not well understood, there's no clear definition, but I do think it's worth exploring where there's a trigger, how professional skepticism may actually lead to what I see as a upper end of professional skepticism, which is something like a suspicious mindset. So I would support exploring a little bit more on that. Support all possible action relating to enhancing professional skepticism. Clearly, I like the idea of example scenarios. I'm also particularly intrigued by the publication by GPPC referred to in the paper in 44F, particularly the recommendation in part 2 about framing the ISA in some parts in ways that encourage a skeptical mindset. I would encourage the working group to review that possibility. The only other thing I'll just mention is on non-material fraud. I agree not to add a lot more in that space, but really just to remind auditors that they need to do more work to establish that it's really non-material and that it's not the tip of a very well-hidden iceberg. So that'll be all I have in this category. Generally very supportive. Thanks.
Thank you. Kaiue?
Thanks, Tom. In relation to possible action number 4, I agree with the view in little a, that a suspicious mindset not be pursued in the ISAs. It is therefore unclear to me why little b suggests pursuing it, particularly when the work of the professional skepticism subgroup showed that is not the mindset that needs to be changed, but that professional skepticism needs to be applied appropriately when circumstances change so that auditors respond appropriately to indications of fraud. I'm therefore not in favor of little b. For these reasons, I agree with not considering a scaled approach as set forth in little c. With respect to enhancing auditor consideration on professional skepticism in the second little a, I do not mind looking a stronger language such a question, call into question, or reconsider, but believe that the word challenge in relation to auditor behavior for normal circumstances other than when fraud is suspected to be inappropriate. It seems to be that the requirement to consider contradictory evidence is already being addressed in the audit evidence project and therefore does not need to be addressed twice. Items little b and little c are, in my view, acceptable. Next action in relation to possible action number 5. I believe that little I would just bring the standard in line with the risk-based approach, and little I makes sense given advance in technology. However, unless we can demonstrate that audit failures due to not testing journal entries throughout the period have taken place, I'm not in favor of extended journal entry testing to the entire period, since this is a significant increase in work effort where we need to be sure that it would bring the appropriate benefits in terms of avoiding audit failure. In my view, item little b would be helpful to auditors, whether in the application material or non-authoritative guidance. I cannot yet determine what the changes to ISO 500 would be, so it is too early to determine what needs to be considered presented to little c. Then in relation to action number 6, I'm in favor of modernizing ISO 240 for modern technology in consultation with the technology working group and considering additional non-authoritative guidance. Very briefly to possible action number 7, I believe that the actions proposed are sensible. Also a little brief to action number 5, I believe that some further guidance as a proposed may be helpful. My comment to possible actions number 9, I'm not opposed to considering whether additional fraud-related specific documentation requirements are needed, but care needs to be taken to determine the proportionality of such considerations. Certainly considering the changes and implication from the CUSP is reasonable. In relation to possible action number 10, unless there are clear indications that the failure to set analytical procedures at the planning and the closing stage of the audit led to audit failure with respect to detecting material fraud, I would not be in favor of the action proposed in little a. I'm in favor of considering the role of technology in little b. And in relation to action or possible action number 11, I believe that the links between ISA 240 and other ISAs are in the ISAs, and I'm not convinced that adding to the ladder of representation will help auditors detect more material fraud. In my jurisdiction, for example, internal audit almost always reports to management and not to those charged with governance. So item little d would not be particularly useful. However, non-authoritative guidance on the connectivity between standards may be helpful. Okay, thanks for having me, and I give back to you, Tom.
Thank you, Kai. Wendy.
Thank you, Tom. And I feel like I'm in the same order as I was the first time I spoke. So I thank you, Eric. You pretty much, as I scroll down, said everything I had to say. I will just emphasize number 4, strongly supportive and satisfied with enhancing professional skepticism within the context of fraud. And especially after the CUSP discussion yesterday, I don't think we need to add anything else to the spectrum. And then the other comment I want to make, and all the others I'm supportive of, the other comment I want to make is related to journal entry testing, because I think journal entry testing has been a challenge for auditors since the standards were issued. And I think firms have continuously tried to provide materials for auditors to do a better job. And so I think that is an area that certainly needs to be, I like the path there. And from the funnel perspective, I would put that high funnel it all the way down as something we certainly need to, whether it's adjusting the standard or application material or whatever it is, that's an area that will certainly help improve the quality of audits. And that's all I'm going to add.
Thank you. Sue?
Thanks. And just briefly, I support not progressing with suspicious mindset as a specific term. I think the change in behaviour will be achieved more by promoting how professional skepticism is applied in certain circumstances, as you've outlined. On journal entries, I think, Lynn, you mentioned 315, and certainly I support focusing more on where and how the risk arises from journal entries in the particular circumstances and designing tests to address that risk, which could be during the year or at the year end. And on unpredictability, I agree with the proposal to develop more guidance, but echo the point around LCEs as to how that applies in the LCE environment, and whether that's maybe something for the LCE standard. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we got some good feedback in that section. A lot of it was supportive in general of the working group suggestions, but throughout we got some some caution, some suggestions, some need for further consideration. Lynn, I turn it back to you, and then maybe we'll take a quick break.
Thanks very much, Tom, and thanks for all that feedback. I think, Tom, you've summarised it very well. Just before we go to our break, I'm not renowned for being a morning person, and this morning I have been very remiss. I haven't acknowledged all of the working group. So can I just acknowledge that Imran and Fabian are on the working group as well, and apologise to them most sincerely for missing them off my list this morning. So with that, Tom, I'll turn back to you.
Thank you. What do people need a break?
I do.
Yes. So what I suggest is that we break for 10 minutes, reconvene at 5 minutes to the hour. I'll see you shortly. Hi, can we start reconvening? Hopefully everyone's got a little refreshment. A few more people need to join, including Lynn, if you're there. Lynn, are you here? Okay, we're back. We're gonna try to get through the remainder in the next hour. Lynn, are you ready to lead off again?
I am.
Great.
Thanks, Tom, and welcome back, everybody. The next couple of areas, I'm just going to put them on the table as the feedback we got, rather than having a long discussion on them. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, we asked in the discussion paper about forensic specialists and whether they should be a part of the audit team or not. And we got very mixed views on this. Some people thought that they should be a part of some audits, particularly those that had identified or suspected or high-risk entities, and that they would be useful in terms of discussions on risk assessment and investigation. The other side were of the view that the standard gives us enough flexibility for a practitioner to decide that forensic audits are different in nature to financial statement audits. There's real issues of scalability and proportionality, particularly for small audits, and for small firms it would be an unnecessary burden, and that it could widen the expectation gap. This is an area where we need to do some more thinking about which way we should head in terms of the project proposal. Next slide, please. There were comments about the definition of fraud that is in 240 and whether it should be updated. Particularly in some jurisdictions, people include bribery and corruption in the definition. We want to discuss this further because changing the definition can have unintended consequences or flow-through effects that we need to think about before we make any final decisions here. So what we intend to do is look at some alternative paths forward for more, and have put those before you at either the June or the July board meeting to discuss further. Next slide, please. Tom, I have got a pause for discussion here, but I think I'd like to continue on to the next set and take all the comments together, if that's okay.
That's the chair's prerogative.
Excellent, thank you. So we'll move on to the next slide, please. Okay, another area where there were different views was in terms of the auditor report. We asked people whether they thought the auditor's report should be extended and more information about what the auditor does added into it. Those in support agreed with that and thought it would be useful not only to have the auditor's responsibilities, but the procedures that were carried out and the conclusions related to fraud. They, however, cautioned that it shouldn't be boilerplate and that it should be bespoke information. On the other side, people said that the auditor's report was already becoming very lengthy and complex. It would probably become perfunctory if it was introduced and was unlikely to effectively address the knowledge gap. This is an area that we want to talk to the auditor reporting group on to see if there's any useful input that they can provide us in terms of that, and we need to then do some analysis and think about where we should go in this area. Next slide, please. In the introductory section of 240, it talks a lot about what we don't do and what we can't do. And there were questions from particularly in the regulatory and monitoring group area about whether that introductory material should be more positive about what we do in terms of an audit, and if we should change the emphasis. This is an area that we need future thinking, and I do believe that the CUSP project will be helpful in this regard. Next slide, please. Actually, I'm just going to jump this one because I don't think it's a critical one, and I'm going to move to the next slide. Okay, and the final slide in this area is we have 240 about fraud, and we have 250 regarding non-compliance with laws and regulations. And obviously those two standards have a close relationship, but the nature of that relationship and when each of them applies is not crystal clear to everybody who responded. Neither is it crystal clear to the working group at this point in time as to what we should do about this. So this is an area that we are going to think about more and bring back to the board at a future meeting. Next slide, please. So that's what we've heard in terms of those 4 areas on the slide and the definition of fraud and forensic specialists. There isn't much we haven't come to conclusions about the proposed action at present, but interested from the board about any particular balance you think, or any topics you think are particularly important, or if you have strong views about the approach we should take. It would be useful to hear those now. So thank you, Tom. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Okay. comments on these 4 sections. Wendy, I'm going to ask you to come in early on this so you're not at the end if you want to speak too. Josephine.
Do you want me to let Wendy go first, Tom? Or
If you're willing to do it, I just was giving her a moment to collect her thoughts. I just didn't want Wendy to be last. Nor do I want Wendy to be on mute.
Very uncoordinated with my hand and the mute button. But I thank you for putting my hand down, because at some point I was trying to do that as well. So now I'm more coordinated. Okay, so we're on 12 to 17, right?
Yep.
Okay, so the only one I feel strongly about is 12, which is it 12? Did we already? Sorry. Determining whether and how forensic type procedures may be appropriate in an audit. And I think, my thoughts around that are, we don't need to change the standard, but we probably need some guidance to point auditors in the direction of when you might bring in an expert and when an expert might be helpful in designing your procedures. And I even take that back to some of the personal experiences that I've had as an auditor, and when we've had presentations from forensics experts, and they think very differently. But I think it would be overkill to say that you need to consult with an expert, a forensic expert, in every single circumstance. So I'm thinking that the guidance might be the circumstances that would lead you there, or a collection of circumstances, but very, very much driven off of professional judgment and professional skepticism. And that was, I think, the only one in this area that I felt strongly about. Oh, 14. 14, in terms of the funnel, I think we can leave this high in the funnel in terms of, I agree, adding any more to the auditor's report, I don't think will be helpful. And I think we have to wait for the post-implementation review to be completed on auditor reporting. So those were the two that I wanted to comment on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
And Josephine, thank you for ceding the floor for a moment. The floor is yours.
Of course. Cantering through forensics, I agree with the working group view on this, and with Wendy's point as well, that, taking into account proportionality, scalability, relevance, there may not be a call for this or call for those types of procedures in all audits. But as the working group explore this further, it would be helpful to consider, again, Wendy made this point, if more prompts are needed in the standard to address the need for specialist skills, particularly where ROM in relation to fraud is identified. Currently, this consideration is just tucked away in the application material, including references to forensic experts. So just bringing that up to the fore and making that part of some planning decisions, or even a discussion amongst the engagement team, which we'll get to, would be helpful, I think. And we thought it was very important in the UK to make this point, and so we have actually included that in our proposed requirements. In terms of definitions, even of fraud, I do support exploration, but you probably know I'm very, very wary about changing our definitions. And I think this is one definition which is sufficiently principles-based that it captures all those other ideas. So I think this is more fitting for non-authoritative guidance, where we talk about this is the definition, but these are the other words, terms you might hear, and this is how they fit into that definition. I think that would be helpful to practitioners and users. I agree on the auditor's report. I'm supportive of looking at the introductory language in ISA 240. Obviously, there's a lot of references to the UK there. We did have similar feedback to that of the monitoring group on this issue. And to address the situation using your words, Lynn, we just flipped a few words around to make it more positive. but we were very careful about making sure we were consistent with the language in ISA 200 and any changes that we made there. And I'm certainly supportive of the task force proposals in terms of strengthening the links to 315 and thinking more generally about greater engagement of the audit team and those discussions in respect of fraud, and moving away from what is often described to us inspections team as a checklist approach. We did also elevate and adapt some of the application material there because there's more open discussions about fraud risk factors, and the idea of not just having one discussion at one point and coming back to it just to check in, as it were, to make sure that original decisions made were still valid, is important to think about. And I'm not sure why, to the other point on specialists, wouldn't be involved in that discussion, so I would support exploration around there. Certainly on clarifying the relationship with 240 and 250. And then I'm just, yeah, and that's where we are. Thanks, Lynn.
Thank you. Coyote?
Thanks, Tom. Very briefly to action number 12. I'm in favor of the proposed way forward as described in this possible action. Then in relation to possible action number 13, I'm not in favor of changing the definition of fraud at this time. There's a danger that in changing the definition, it may extend to matters that do not have an impact on financial statements or that are already covered by ISA 250. For this reason, I would prefer that the relationship between ISA 240 and 250 be clarified, especially for non-auditor stakeholders would appear to confuse the two. Then my remark to possible action 14, I agree with the way, with the proposed way forward for this action. Then my comment in relation to possible action number 15, I'm in favor of the proposed way forward. However, I do support clarifying the inherent limitations of an audit in relation to fraud as described in the ISAs, but that includes both emphasizing the responsibilities of the auditor more and being much clearer about what those inherent limitations are. Based on my experience, non-auditors often have uninformed views about inherent limitations of audits in relation to fraud, and these do not need to be addressed. In relation to possible action number 16, unless there's clear evidence that auditors did not detect fraud because there was insufficient emphasis on fraud in the engagement team discussion, I'm not in favor of further augmentation of the engagement team discussion because it is unclear what the benefits would be. And my last comment in relation to possible action number 17. It is unclear to me why little a and little b are needed if auditors suspect fraud due to information obtained through work on ISA 250 or anywhere else during the audit, or suspect non-compliance with laws or regulation due to their work on ISA 240 or anywhere else during the audit. Auditors need to respond. Linking these two standards in this way serves little purpose. However, I do believe that the scope of the true standards is often misunderstood by non-auditor stakeholders, and therefore I would support clarifying their relative scopes. That's all. Thanks.
Thanks, Kai. Chun-Li?
Thanks, Tom. So on the forensic specialist and the part on inherent limitations, actually, I was just going to say that I agree, and then let's look at what the UK FRC has done, excuse me, consultation, and let's follow up on the response that's been received, because I quite like what they've done there, especially in terms of the inherent limitation, saying that despite all these things, the inherent limitation that's being articulated, it does not diminish the responsibility, which I thought is quite a neat way. So of course, Josephine has highlighted that, and I know that the working group will be following up. On the transparency bit, paragraph 83D referred to feedback about how extensive information may mislead users into thinking that issues relating to fraud, when that may not be the case. And I know many of us have the sort of opposite concern that when every report comes with that fraud disclosure, it becomes boilerplate, and the real problematic one gets hidden. So I agree with the working group's approach in terms of proceeding very cautiously. And I think the one point I want to make here is from the outreach we've done, what we've heard is that if we're going to do anything around increasing transparency in the auditor's report, that in order for that to be helpful and impactful, that has to be complemented by enhanced transparency on the part of the management, those charged with governance as well. And I know that that's not within our remit, but I would encourage us to think about ways we can influence that as we proceed. Just one last point I want to make, and relating to engagement team discussion, again, agree that we need to move cautiously. I don't think we need to do much around that. And for example, what is mentioned there in B, I can't scroll fast enough, but I think that's about having two discussions or something like that. I think we want to avoid being too prescriptive. And I think that there are a lot of areas where we need to learn to rely on the judgment of the practitioners and be principle-based. So I just want to put that caution out there. Thanks.
Thank you. Roger?
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. Again, supportive of them. The one I want to comment on is 17. I agree with the sentiment of Kai Yui. I think that around the table on informed people, we have drawn a distinction between 240 fraud and non-compliance with law and regulations, which we understand. But I do think with a lot of people who are less informed, that they struggle with that distinction. You will hear comments mainly from the people who are informed. So you have to be careful about what comments you do hear, because people have worked with that. I would be cautious about trying to fix it through a redefinition of fraud. I think we have a commonly used definition of fraud. So again, I don't stop you exploring it, but I think moving away from a definition which has been around for a while always causes problems. Of trying to redefine a common term. So I'd be cautious about those, but supportive, but certainly 17 is an area I think could do with some clarification. Thanks.
Thanks, Roger. Fernando?
Thanks, Tom. Lynn, as well, I'm very supportive on having some flexibility when using experts. Otherwise, I think it could create consequences, as you mentioned. In terms of the definition for purpose of the audit, I think it should be aligned to the objective of the standard and the requirements. If it is not the case, probably we could create a bigger gap and more expectations of what people are having today, and the level of work effort is not gonna compensate the change in the definition. And for the rest of the items, yes, I understand that you will need to have more discussion. What it is not really clear to me is if those discussions are inside the task force with the board members, or you have an intention to touch base with third parties or someone outside the board to gather more information, or go back to people who wrote the letters and ask them in more detail? Just curious what really will happen in that process of deeper analysis.
Okay, I'm sure that question could be picked up in response at the end. Sachika.
Thank you. I just would like to comment on action 14, and my comment is very similar to Wendy's point. So thank you for making the comment at the beginning. I think adding new item and making the report longer is not so helpful. Instead of adding more item to the auditor's report, I think it is effective if we try to support so that description and the current requirements become more useful to the stakeholder. But that being said, I support that we need to further analyze what we can do at this time moment in light of comments we received. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Kai Martin.
Thank you. My comment relates also to 14, very similar to what Sachiko just said. I support that we're further exploring how we can do this, but caution against the consequences of the changes, potential consequences. Also considering that when we do this, we need to make sure that what we do would fit for all sizes and complexities. I think especially around the reporting, some of this might become very procedural, when you come down to the small and complex, less complex entities, and may at some point almost be unmanageable. So keeping that in mind, especially on the reporting, but I think in general is something that we need to make sure. And I know that it's on your list, you also already said. So I just wanted to support that. Thanks.
Thank you. Isabel, last but not least.
Thank you. I agree that all the topics that have been included in these sections are the one on which people have expressed the most mixed views. And I agree that there is no easy fix, so that more discussion is needed. Like Fernando, I had the question on how are we going to do that? Is it for us, the board, to discuss? Because we have a lot of comments. We had the we had a lot. If we have not collected enough feedback, how are we going to do on our own to collect sufficient feedback to decide what to do? And also about the timing of this discussion. Are we going to be able to answer to this question in the same timing as the other part for which we have already discussed?
We're having some connectivity problems, Isabel. Okay, maybe Isabel could share those comments offline. We got some of the gist of it. I apologize, Isabel, on it. One of the only things I had a question on, and maybe Lynn or the team could add to it, on the issue of the auditor's report. I did remember there was some dichotomy in the discussion during the roundtables that investors in particular and certain regulators were more interested in that exploration. And I'm not sure that we got that fully reflected in the document, but I just wanted to put that out there. I know that the working group is sensitive to it, but I do think that that gives it a little bit added weight for consideration. And I think it should be noted on the record that investors who had participated in that specific, we had that roundtable that was really dedicated to try to get their voices heard, did call for it. So I just wanted that on the record, and at least from my standpoint, would think it's a reason to explore it, if nothing else. Back to you.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for all those comments. In terms of what I heard, and I'm not going to try and summarise the whole thing, certainly I heard significant caution around the definition of fraud. On auditor reporting, it's certainly going to be one of our challenges because there are very, very mixed views in this area, and I think they were reflected in the board as well. And certainly I heard the calls in terms of Action 17 in terms of 240 and 250 that there was support for taking that further. In terms of Fernando's question about what we're going to do next, for all of these areas where we've got mixed views, our intention is, one, to do deeper analysis of the letters and see if there's anything and any gems in there that we can take further. We also intend to talk to the other working groups and task forces because in many cases there are touch points between us. And we have also incorporated these ideas into our root cause analysis that we're doing across law enforcement agencies, the firms and regulators. And so bringing all of that together is what we intend to do, thinking about what we can do, and then bringing back the key topics to the June, July phone calls or meetings. So that's the process we're going to go through with these areas where there is mixed views or uncertainty going forward. Just to give you a roadmap of what we're going to do in the last half hour, I intend to take the slides 27 to 38 as one clump, and then the slides from 39 on as the second. We may not get comments on the second group, but they are the ones we've actually talked about throughout the meeting. So with that, Tom, can I move on? Next slide, please. Okay, this is an important issue that was raised by a number of people, and that is the rebuttable presumption, particularly in terms of revenue. And people believe that there is inconsistent application in this area and questioned whether there are areas beyond revenue that should be emphasised in the fraud standard. And just as a couple of examples, inventory and property valuation were raised there. This is one where there are different views. Some believe that this, the rebuttable presumption on revenue is outdated and focuses too much on an area of little risk, whereas others believe it should be kept. So we think on balance we heard it should be kept, but it's certainly something we then need to think of. It is going to be kept. How do we get more consistent application? And also it's an open question whether we should expand the rebuttable presumption. Next slide, please. In terms of external confirmations, the 4 dot points there, I think, explain very well the issues that were raised in terms of this. How do we assess the reliability of external confirmations? How do we respond to non-replies and confirmations? Should there be stronger expectations for obtaining external confirmations? And how do we apply professional skepticism when evaluating those? And question here is whether we should be actually looking at 240 here or the external confirmation ISA. So where we are, next slide please, in terms of our proposed actions on both of these is basically, in summary, more work. You can flip to slide 32 please. Thank you.
One less.
One less. Okay, now moving on to the slides around where there were calls for non-authoritative guidance, third-party fraud, a sense that just a minute, let me get to my bit. There weren't strong calls for change here. So whether we should have guidance or not is what we're considering, but we're not recommending expanding the role of the auditor to detect third-party fraud, and that is well supported by the letters. Next slide, please. The list of suggestions of areas for non-authoritative materials and where people think they might be helpful is very extensive. It goes from areas like materiality to common fraud themes to common risk factors to professional skepticism to distinguishing between listed entities and less complex entities, and on and on. This is sort of a wrap up of all of the calls we had in the material of other areas. It's something once we've decided where we're going, we need to use as a bit of a checklist to make sure we've covered the major issues. This slide is more for information than for comment. Can we move on to slide 36, please? Thank you. We have two areas where we're suggesting no further action. I think one is more less contentious than the other. The first one is on EQR. There were some senses that EQR should be heightened and that there are countries around the world that are suggesting that you have a more suspicious or heightened risk assessment due to fraud existing. Our opinion is that the feedback was not strong enough for us to do anything in an area where we've just revised the standard. We believe it's fit for purpose, so we're not anticipating doing any more in that area. Next slide, please. The expectation gap was a useful way to get people to think about both fraud and going concern. And there were certainly some very helpful comments there. But the working group have considered this, and doing any further about the primary causes of the expectation gap or what solutions should be put in place, we believe is a step too far for this project. It's a much, much bigger issue and should be seen through a bigger lens than just fraud. So it is not our intention to recommend in the project proposal any further refinement of the description of the expectation gap. So with that, if we move on to the next slide, and if you can just read the all 6 items that I have covered for discussion now. So that is just to the rebuttable presumption, external confirmations, third-party fraud. I don't think we need to discuss development of non-authoritative guidance, EQC and the expectation gap. So we've got 5 items for further, for any input at this stage, noting that these are all ones under development. Thanks, Tom. Back to you.
Okay, great. We'll let people pause for a second to gather their thoughts because there's a number of sections. 18 through, I think it was 25 actions. 24. Okay, Josephine.
Thank you. Lynn, is also requirements when fraud is detected was in that original grouping. Are you?
True, it is. I jumped up.
That's fine. So, thank you. For rebuttable presumption then, yep, support the direction of the working group, particularly considering whether there are other areas beyond revenue recognition that should have increased focus, such as cash and impairment. I think we've had that discussion at the board already, and certainly that was the feedback we received in the UK as well. In terms of requirements when fraud is detected, I agree with exploring whether the requirements and application material for when fraud is detected are sufficient. Again, this is all about exploring. External confirmations, yep, support exploring the areas A to D. And then my only other comment is on the expectation gap. I totally agree. It served its purpose, which was to help our stakeholders think about what the actions might be from our perspective. So yeah, no further work there. Thank you.
Thank you. Eric.
Thanks, Tom. I'd like to focus first of all on the rebuttable presumption. I must say, based on what I've heard in practice about the rebuttable presumption, I'm a bit skeptical about the benefits of it in our standard, but I recognize that the preponderance of views is to keep it. But if we do keep it, I agree that we need to provide more guidance around circumstances when it can be rebutted, and particularly there might be some guidance needed about distinguishing the different revenue streams and so forth. Because of those views I have about the rebuttable presumption, I'm not really a fan of expanding it to different areas. I think that is, I just don't think I can agree with that sort of thing, although I agree that there may be more guidance needed about where fraud risks can arise in other areas beyond revenue recognition. I just wouldn't go as far as a rebuttable presumption in that area. Just checking my notes here. I think in the other areas, I was pretty comfortable with the direction of the working group. So thanks.
Okay.
Thank you, Eric. Kaioi?
Thanks, Tom. We'll give you, Lynn, I will give you my comments on possible action number 18 to 23 offline. So I will just address possible action 24. While I agree no further work needs to be done on the expectations gap, I do believe that the IAASB does have a responsibility in the public interest to seek to reduce the knowledge and reasonable gaps through the education. This should be addressed in the possible action number 27 on education. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you, Kai. Spoken like an educator, too. Chen Wei.
Thank you, Tom. So for this group, I only have 3 quick comments. Rebuttable presumption, I agree with the way forward as articulated by the working group. I particularly agree with one of the feedback we received that is listed in paragraph 96, A, Roman 2, that while we focus too much on revenue recognition, that may result in insufficient attention being given to many other ways fraud may be perpetrated, which I think is actually a very important point. And I understand that the working group is now investigating and talking to different regulators and so on about the different ways fraud are being perpetrated in practice. So I think that will provide us with very useful information on the way forward. Just moving, there's a lot to scroll through. I think the next, apologies. My next comment is on page 57, and that's on the third-party fraud. I think from our outreach, we didn't receive very strong feedback on that as well. Some stakeholders did note that in today's climate, in light of COVID-19, there may be a need for some guidance on what auditors need to do on third-party fraud, for example, relating to cybersecurity risk and how that interacts with financial reporting. So just want to highlight that as the feedback we received. Last quick comment that I have is just on EQR. I agree that given QM2 has just been released, we probably don't need to do a lot more. But I think a lot of there's a lot of agreement in terms of material misstatement arising from fraud would likely be considered significant matter or area requiring significant judgment. And just wondering whether it would be helpful to just make that linkage quite explicitly. Plus, yes, I agree that we should review the Japanese experience to see whether any further changes need to be done. So that'll be my 3 quick comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Chungwei. You set us up perfectly since you asked to review the Japanese experience. Sachika.
Thank you very much. And I actually would like to comment on possible action number 223, enhancing requirements for EQR. Although I support the most of the directions explained in the issue paper, this is the only area that I do not agree with the direction, but I think you may easily predict my answer, Lynn. Because from my experience and outreaches I conducted in Japan, I think enhancement of the EQR process is effective to address fraud risks, not only in my jurisdiction, but also across the globe. I'd like to clarify the basis for my position. I understand that many respondents commented that it is not necessary because a material misstatement arising from fraud already falls within the scope of the EQR. However, key enhancement made in our fraud risk standard in Japan is not about the clarification of the scope of EQR. Rather, it is a requirement for the firm to establish policies and procedures requiring enhanced EQR when the auditor has determined that suspicious of material misstatement due to fraud exists. This enhanced EQR means it may be different from that under circumstances where no suspicious of material misstatement due to fraud has been identified in terms of the scope of the review, as well as experience and authority of the reviewer. And I have obtained a comment from Japanese practitioners that the requirement is very meaningful. And they mentioned that the key benefit of this requirement is that it requires the firm to be involved in the engagement when suspicious of material misstatement due to fraud is identified. It is likely that not all personnel in the firm necessarily has extensive experience in addressing fraud. In addition, addressing fraud needs extensive time and resources, especially if the audited entity is a large and complex company and fraud is conducted by management. Therefore, the mechanism of enhanced engagement quality review helps not only the engagement team by having support by the firm, but also the firm to maintain the quality of audit by reconsidering the appropriateness of resources allocated to the engagement when the auditor had determined suspicious of material misstatement due to fraud exists, including the need of involving specific person who has extensive experience on fraud as an EQ reviewer for the engagement. In addition, when I search the text of IAASB 1 and 2, they do not mention fraud at all. As addressing fraud is so important in the audit, I think IAASB 1 and 2 should have some materials relating to fraud. And I also think enhanced engagement quality review matches with the concept of quality management, because under the quality management system, the firm is required to respond to address quality risk, and quality management review is a specified response that is designed and implemented by the firm. So I think this enhancement will be in the public interest in mind. So I just want to raise that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sashika. Wendy?
Thank you, Tom. So I'll make a few comments. I'm struggling with 18, and the reason I'm struggling with 18 is I keep having to check myself between deferring to non-authoritative guidance or do we need to change the standard? And now that I understand standard setting a lot better, I don't always want to defer to non-authoritative guidance. So for 18, and so now that I've said that, for 18, I do think that auditors are significantly challenged by the differences between when you identified a fraud risk and what that means to your audit strategy and when you identify a significant risk. So if in leaving, and I do think that we should leave this standard as it is, that there's presumed risk of fraud in revenue, but clarify what identifying a fraud risk means in other areas and how it might impact the audit procedures. So, you know, in some standards, I think we might be driven there, like in estimates, but I'm not in the files that I review. I'm not sure it's clear to the auditors when they are designing their audit strategy. And let me see if I have anything else in this area. I like some of the things that Sachiko said about ISQM2, but I also think since it is a new standard and because of some of the other things that we're talking about, they will inform what firms do in terms of ISQM2. So I'm not sure that we really need to go back and address that standard just yet. And otherwise, I'm supportive of the possible actions that the paper identified in the path forward.
Okay. Great. Lynn, that's everyone on these topics.
Okay, thank you. What I heard in terms of those discussions was on the rebuttable assumption, probably leave it, but not universal support for that particular position. As we had not much discussion around requirements when fraud's detected and external confirmations, I'm taking those as agreement on third party fraud. Hear you, Sashiko, on EQR. and we'll certainly keep on top of what's happening in Japan and the real life experience you have. And thank you for the feedback on expectation gap, everybody. So I think that's what I heard, quite a lot of support for us doing more work in those areas. But I mean, as we keep talking about, this funnel has to get narrowed at some point in time. So some of these have to fall off the table, but we will get there. It's just we're in the process, and many of these are reading into the record what we've heard from our respondents, which is the right thing to do in terms of due process. So thank you for your consideration of those to date. If I can now move on to the final clutch of slides, many of which are going to sound familiar because we have transversed some of these topics. So if we can move now to slide 40, please. There has been discussion this morning about root cause analysis and the importance of that. We have thought about this very deeply and are busy looking, trying to get as much evidence as we can in terms of the root causes of recent frauds. We've had a look at the research material and there's some good information there. Most of it is dated because the up-to-date information is often subject to litigation and is rather difficult to get. However, the staff and the working group have reached out to regulators, to law enforcement agencies, and are going to reach out to the firms to have confidential conversations about what are the themes that they are seeing. And we've developed a few questions, and I'll just give you a flavour of those questions. How frauds are being executed and concealed, who's involved in the frauds, what financial accounts are impacted, what was the extent of technology involved, were the frauds small and grew over time, is there anything else we need to know, etc. So we do have those questions available. If any board members have further opportunities for us to get this information, we would really appreciate it. But we are doing our very best to get that, and we will try and relate it in the project proposal, the root causes through to our actions, because it's one way that we can make sure that what we're doing is going to have an impact and is relevant and appropriate. Moving on to the next slide. Fraud doesn't sit alone. It sits within the ecosystem of our own slides, of our own standards, but also in terms of our partners and our the work that is done across the world. So we are very cognizant that there is a lot of work happening. So we will be monitoring the work across different jurisdictions. As examples, following the FRC's consultation on the UK 240, looking at the consultation on restoring trust and audit and governance, corporate governance proposals on reform of the BEIS. We'll be continuing to look at the Japanese frauds standard, and in terms of the work that Accountancy Europe are doing on strengthening the financial reporting ecosystem. We'll continue to do outreach with stakeholders, and there's quite a lot of requests coming in for us to talk to people about fraud. We will obviously coordinate with IAASB as we do on every project, and the linkages between other IAAS projects are becoming increasingly apparent to us. So just to give you some concept of what they may be, and this is not a total list, it's a flavour of a list. We obviously need to keep talking to the audit evidence group, the auditor reporting post-implementation group, the LCE group, the technology group, and professional skepticism. So there's quite a lot of linkages with this project and other work that we are doing. And I'm sure over the next couple of years, that will become increasingly apparent, and making sure we align everything together. Moving on to the next slide, please. We have analysed the letters for where people have asked for education or training on fraud. And we're very conscious that we have a mandate to do some things and a mandate and not a mandate to do other things. So some of the activities that we think we might be able to pursue in terms of education are public communication about the concept of reasonable assurance and what that means, and the impact of materiality in terms of identifying and dealing with fraud. We could potentially have sessions or forums about the role of each participant with other people in the ecosystem, concentrating on the prevention and detection of fraud, as well as the inherent limitations of an audit, and potentially working with the FX education panel about possible changes to how auditors are educated and trained. I think we just have to be careful in this area and judicious about what we do and what we can do. And finally, before I move on to other matters, next slide, please. There are a number of suggestions about what others should be doing, and it is, I think, recognised that we can't fix everything on our own. However, how we transfer these ideas and these concepts and how we look at a multi-stakeholder approach are still things that I think are probably going to be ongoing parts of not only this project, but the work of the IAASB. And we certainly have in mind, rather than having a feedback statement on what we've heard, is actually developing some communication for Tom, who we haven't consulted on this idea, but we think it would be a good idea just to give some high-level feedback back to the community that have responded to us and to our wider audience about the ecosystem and the roles within it. And finally, moving on to the final slide, just for the sake of completeness, not for the sake of discussion, there are a few items that people have emphasised that we think are important because more than one respondent have said them. An emphasis on us making sure that our standard remains principle-based, and the working group and as chair absolutely endorse that. questions about separate assurance engagements over internal controls. I know in the Forum of Firms that was an interesting discussion and a big focus on that in the European context, and a call from the public sector for some more application material in terms of the public sector. And a good example of the difference there is in the public sector, revenue is not the issue, it's expenditure. So the rebuttable presumption for revenue is actually reasonably irrelevant in the public sector because most of the revenue comes from tax and is a given. So that's what we think is a fair representation of what we heard in 85 respondent letters, a number of round tables, and a goodly amount of research that has been gone through meticulously and carefully by our staff. So I know we're at time. I don't actually think we desperately need any responses to these areas, Tom. I think they are areas that are for information only and they will ongoingly develop. But if people did have comments, we'd be happy to receive them offline.
My only comment is it's a very effective way to get me to do something by asking on the public record. But the answer is yes. And I know our going concern colleagues will probably ask me the exact same thing afterwards too.
I did think we should coordinate.
Yes. Okay, before I bring this to a close, I wanted to ask Karen Stothers if you'd like to comment from the PIOB perspective.
Thanks very much. I don't see myself in the video, which is very interesting. I wonder what happened there, but hopefully you can hear me.
You're in the San Francisco fog, it seems like.
I guess I've disappeared. Now, I do have two animals right at my feet because it's 7 p.m. here, and I believe they're saying dinner. So I just wanted to say, I think this was a very, very good discussion. And from the PIOB's perspective, you will all appreciate how important the fraud project is from our perspective for the public interest. You've put together a very comprehensive document, and I really appreciated the comments at the beginning of the discussion about whether this was a very detailed menu and whether I too could afford the $75 Canadian. So I was very glad to hear that further work will be coming forward, and especially on the root cause analysis. Because I think the PIOB's view is that there is a lot of potential in that root cause analysis on serving the public interest. So thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you, Karen. So I want to, does anyone have any other reaction they want to raise? Again, I think the working group is quite open to it. So we've begun the funneling process. We've decided we don't like 30-page menus. We're going to get the menu down to a nice cart where we know what our priorities are and realistically could fill the order. But great work. I think I'm looking at Eric. You're right next to me. You're the one who brought the metaphor in today, so I think you'll get the credit for that one. But thank you.
That's why Karen's dogs are hungry. They saw the menu too. Yeah.
We'll ask what type of restaurant on the next call. So thank you, Lynn and team, for your work, your detailed efforts, and we're making progress, I think, on this important topic. I sense some form of standard setting coming in the future. Okay, we're going to close right now. So thank you, everyone, for participating and staying on board. Draft minutes will be circulated in due course, and looking forward for June approval at our June meeting, together with our March minutes. And then the next meeting, IAASB meeting, is scheduled for May 10 and 11, where we'll be discussing the LCE standard and going concern. Just remember, the quarterly meeting is begins on June 14. And the links for the main meetings will be distributed shortly, and the agenda is available on the IAASB's website. So thank you all for joining. Thank you for the public observers for joining.